I want to finish with just some of the research findings on gender and negotiation. So in some ways, we'll finish where we started by talking about how there's a gender overlay on a lot of the best practices that we're talking about. Before I go into the slides that I just gave you, I want to just do one fun little thing because it illustrates some of the things we've been talking about thus far. I just need 2 volunteers. Can I get just 2 volunteers? Yeah, that'd be great. Terrific. So over here, maybe one person over here. Can I ask you to volunteer? Is that okay?
Sure.
There's nothing. No, don't have to stand up. It's very low. It's a small ask. So I guess I'll ask Tina. Tina, can I ask you to be the proposer? Okay. Now let's do this for real money, just to make it mildly interesting. And here's $20. So here's 20. So Tina, I'll ask you to propose some fraction of the 20 to Ellen. Okay. So Ellen, you're the responder, and you have a very simple role: either say yes or no. Okay. If you say yes, then you're accepting the split. So Tina's going to offer X. If you say yes, then you get X, and Tina, you keep the rest. Okay. If you say no, then you both get nothing, and I get my 20 back. Okay. And don't worry about me and all this. You know, I'll just take it out of the kids' college fund. So don't worry about me.
Worry about Amy. She's the
Amy is the one you should worry. No, she drives a Ferrari, as I mentioned. Just think before you propose X. Just let's collectively think about if you were in Tina's shoes, what would you offer? What would be your X that you put on the table? And likewise, if you were in Ellen's shoes, what would be the offer that you'd be willing to accept? Just kind of mentally think about that for a second. Okay.
Does Ellen know that she's got $20?
I don't know. Ellen, do you know?
I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, no, look, this is a little exercise, and Ellen, I guess you know everything that's on the screen, including the $20, okay? Good. So Tina, I just need a number. I need X. What's your X?
11.
11. So just to be clear, you're offering 11 to Ellen, and you're going to keep 9 for yourself.
Yes.
Yes, for sure. Good. All right, we'll sort it out. We'll get some change. We'll sort it out after class. Right? Good. Why did you offer 11?
Because it was more than half.
Okay.
That is fair.
That is fair. Okay. Why not 10? Why not 9? I mean, 10 would seem fair. 9 would seem fair. What's wrong? What's special about 11?
I thought 11 was more appealing.
Okay. Yeah. So, what would you have accepted? What's the minimum you would have accepted?
$1.
$1.
I mean, it's more than I had, right? If I said no, neither one of us get it.
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
Well, if you're going for the midpoint mindset,
Yeah.
I would have offered 5. And then the other party could have.
5 is the midpoint of 1 and what?
0 and 10. If I knew my
There's no
was
counter-offer.
10.
Oh, I see. This is a one-shot thing. It's simply one shot. It's called the ultimatum game because Tina makes a one-shot offer to Ellen. Ellen has a yes or no decision. What's the rational number?
10.
So interesting.
Nothing.
In my mind, 1 isn't fair, and so what's $1 to me? I'd rather have 10. So if she's going to be greedy, then I'm going to say no.
You're going to say no. So anything less than 10, you'd say no.
But she has the money.
Only if I say yes, she has the money.
So anything less than 10, you would say no.
Well, I mean, maybe I would have said yes to 5, but if she would have offered me 1, I would have been like that. No deal.
Okay.
But
Now,
what did it cost you to say? It didn't cost me anything to say
It's not fair.
yes. Principles cost you money. Principles are expensive.
so you would have taken 1, Ellen.
Sure, why not?
Yeah, I mean,
I'm still
it's-
one off better than I was.
It's certainly better off than your BATNA of getting nothing.
Right.
So 1 would have been accepted. But Tina, you didn't offer 1.
No, because I thought, okay, so it's 20, we split it 10-10, that's even, but doesn't 11 sound a little bit better?
Yeah, very generous. Very generous. But Ellen says, with hindsight, Ellen says, you left $10 on the table. Right? You could have offered her 1. She would have taken the 1. And look, I mean, this is relatively very small stakes, but you left $10 on the table, says Ellen. This has been well studied by economists, by psychologists, it is this funny notion that one is highly rational for you to accept, but most responders, and you're an outlier, but most responders say, I would walk away from 5 or 6 or 7, 8 or 9 maybe, and 10 for sure I would take, right? And therefore, people in Tina's shoes have to offer more than the, quote, rational number, even though it's in the ZOPA. 1 is better than your Batman. It's in the ZOPA. But you would say, wait a minute here, I've got to do more than that because otherwise she's going to say no.
Right.
So it's called the ultimatum game. It's been studied. And the basic idea that I wanted to illustrate, I think comes out of it is people will walk away from offers not because it's not in the ZOPA. This is all perfectly in the ZOPA, but because it's just not fair. And therefore, it's important to shape perceptions of fairness in the deal and not just put an offer on the table because I said so or because I've got the leverage in the situation. Shaping perceptions of fairness is just as important as the substantive terms of the deal.
But isn't offering $1 like throwing down the X in the other game?
Yep.
You're
Well-
coming out with an X at the beginning?
Ellen says, I mean, if I walked up to Ellen and said, here's $1, she might have said, that's kind of weird, but okay, fine, it's better than my dad. But I guess you're saying it's the idea that Ellen should only get 1 when Tina gets 19, that's the X card.
But she has the ability to say no and they'll both get nothing.
Correct.
She only loses $1. That's
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, right? So it is a, quote, puzzle for economists, because economists would say 1 is the rational offer, and the Ellens, the equivalent, should be saying yes to $1. Now, again, I point this out because when I asked what's the right offer just a minute ago, there was a striking comment, I think kind of collective comment of 10. That's the right offer. 10 is the right offer because that's what's fair. I will tell you, when I asked the same question at Harvard Business School, what's the right offer? People say 1. And it's obviously a more male-dominated group. And it's in some ways both are correct. 1 is correct in the sense that that's the rational offer to make, and the responder should say yes to the 1. On the other hand, there's an intuition of, wait a minute, that's just not fair. It's not fair for one person to get 19 and one person to get 1. Now look, there's no single right answer, but to be aware that perceptions of fairness matter. As I mentioned earlier, when you say to my students, how satisfied do you feel about the outcome, there is no correlation, zero correlation between the objective measure, that is how far they are on the histogram, and how good they feel about it. It is all to do with how good do I feel about the process. Did I trust the other side? Was there good communication? Did we build a good relationship between us? All that matters much more than the objective outcome.
And despite offer, because you've mentioned something about this before, you've got a room full of very, very experienced people in this room as opposed to your students.
Yeah.
So maybe just consider that it may not have been a reflection of gender.
Yeah.
It may have been a reflection of a lot of business savvy and women just who understand what the fair and right and feel good thing is to do.
Well taken. Again, I'll be provocative because I'm on the next plane back to Boston in a few hours. When I ask my MBAs, I get the 1 is the right answer. When I ask my AMP students, with these C-suite people, mostly men, very international group, it is overwhelmingly 1 is the right answer. So again, I'm not trying to diagnose what's going on here, but these very experienced business people say, 1 is the right answer. Now, by the way, I actually think that your approach is the better approach, which is to say process matters. And you want to manage the process just as much as you're managing the objective outcome. But to be aware that there are others in the world who, when they got the opportunity to offer 1, they will do so. And you want to be able to protect yourself against those kinds of approaches by diffusing anchors and all things we've talked about thus far. By the way, there's an interesting analogy to medical school. Medical school at Harvard and other places, they used to teach a lot about technical skills, so how do you do surgery and so on. But at Harvard Medical School, they found out that the medical graduates were lousy with their bedside manner. And when they do these studies of when are doctors sued by their patient, it's not correlated with objective measures of negligence. It's correlated entirely with bedside manner. Did the doctor care about me as a patient? If the answer is yes, there's no lawsuit. If the answer is no, lawsuit. And so Harvard Medical School reshaped its entire curriculum about 10 years ago to say we want to teach bedside manner. Process matters, not at the expense of technical excellence, but in addition to it. So just as an example from the medical profession. I'll skip this, but just to say, and kind of move to our topic for the rest of the day, best practices for effective negotiation. We've been touching on this throughout the day, but I want to try to synthesize it and put it in one place so that we can have a final conversation about what I see as being best practices overall. As you begin, we haven't talked about body language. I want to say a few words about body language. Framing the negotiations is a joint problem-solving process. Tit for tat, we talked about that this morning. I'll say a few more words about that. Identify the ZOPA. How do you do that? Again, we've talked about this during the day. Share information, but not in folk, not in the form of full, open, truthful exchange. That is a conceptual possibility. But notice that by putting all your cards on the table, you would expose yourself to value claimed by the other side. Rather, share information reciprocally. And we had some nice examples of this during the exercise. Put some information on the table, see if they reciprocate. And if, but only if they reciprocate, you can proceed in this kind of virtuous cycle kind of way. Play the Y card to start, and see if they respond to the Y card. If they do, you can continue in that direction. Ask questions, we talked about that. And a skill I'll offer you in this final session, active listening. It is such a painfully obvious thing when I put it on the screen, but it is so hard to do in practice. Really listening to the other side is important, and I'll offer you specific tools for doing that. Proposed MESOs, we talked about this already. Multiple equivalent simultaneous offers, not just issue by issue and locking it down, but negotiating packages. And the phrase I offered before is, nothing is decided until everything is decided. And just as a funny side story, I was down in Houston, Texas, a bunch of you from Houston. I was giving a keynote lecture for the AIPN, International Petroleum Negotiators, something to that effect. And it was two keynotes. It was myself and James Baker. so clearly I'm not in the same category as James Baker. But I gave my speech, and I said, nothing is decided until everything is decided. And then James Baker swoops in with his entourage. He gets up on the stage, and he's talking about international negotiations in the State Department. And he said, in his southern kind of twang, he said, I told my team, nothing is decided until everything is decided. And I said, hey, that's me. That was my And the people who listened to both the lectures kind of made the connection. So I think it's a general tool, and even the former Secretary of State has the same idea. Use strategies of persuasion and influence. I'll offer you what I see as being the key strategies of bias, of influence. We all know that our brains don't work like computers. To me, these are some tools from psychology that you should be aware of, both on offense and on defense. The way I would put it is, I would take these seriously, but not literally. That is, these aren't tricks to pull out of the hat, but rather things to keep in mind as you're negotiating in the room. So I'll say a few words about that. Like before, stop me, ask questions, raise comments. We are on the home stretch, and I do promise to end right on time, if not a few minutes early. But I do want to kind of push through to try to synthesize and bring this together. And like I said, I'll finish with about 15, 20 minutes on the effect of gender on negotiation. Okay, so before you begin, we talked about this in passing, managing the physical environment. In general, the big room, meaning the conference room where everybody shows up, that's a very dangerous place. My recommendation is one-on-one meetings. Think about BATNAs, ask questions, practice investigative negotiations, all before you go to the big room. And really, when I see great negotiators, they are arranging the chessboard well before they get to the big room, to the point where by the time they finally get to the room, a lot of the hard work has been done. Choose the right venue. Consider dinner, lunch, breakfast meetings. In general, they're better for brainstorming, building rapport than an in-office meeting. So sometimes the more informal environment can be useful rather than being in the office. A third tool I would offer is a listening meeting. This can be particularly useful if things have broken down. Go to the other side and be very explicit in your goal that all I want to do is listen to what you have to say. I'm not going to respond to it. I'm not going to agree with it necessarily, but I want to listen to what you have to say. Take notes, and then maybe even report back on what you heard in the room and how your proposal addresses those key ideas. Now, for the lawyers here, I have to say that taking notes is sometimes not recommended. You should probably ask permission. Is it okay if I take some notes? But if you ask permission and they say yes, it is a very powerful visual that what they're saying is so important, you're writing it down. And notice how, if you take notes and then you report it back, you can say how my proposal addresses your interests. You said this, here's how the proposal addresses it. You said this, here's how it addresses it. So it's a very powerful tool to have a listening meeting and then report back. Questions or comments or thoughts? Yeah, please.
In emotional intelligence, there's a chapter that talks about not taking notes in the meeting because you need to be observing what other people are doing around you.
Yeah.
So I guess, is that an important part of negotiations? Similar to
Well, I'll tell you, to me, not writing down copious notes, but being able to acknowledge what they're saying, and I do think taking notes in a selective way is very useful. But let me offer a couple kind of nuances to this point. One is, if it's a particularly important negotiation, you might consider bringing somebody with you whose job it is to take notes, and say, look, my colleague here is here to take notes, is that okay with you? And if so, we'll report back after the conversation. I do think that's best practice. And sometimes what you see is the notes being circulated by email and showing, hey, look, we have nothing to hide here. We want to show you what we heard in the room. Do you agree with what we said? That to me is best practice. What I don't recommend, and I strongly urge you to, maybe this goes to what you just said, is to take notes on a laptop. And I know this is getting pretty tactical, but if you're sitting there with your iPad or your laptop, it clearly puts up a literal wall between you and the other side. To me, the old technology is the best, so the notepad and so on is better because it doesn't put up the same kind of barrier. I guess what I'm trying to say is that notepad approach might be a middle ground between the laptop, which you sometimes see, and the no notes at all. I do think this is a middle ground approach that could be effective to show that you're listening to them. Yeah.
And I know just from an ownership,
Just speak up. Yeah.
from an ownership standpoint, when we're negotiating a lease and we've gotten some on our own, sometimes the tenant may provide comments at the last minute, so it is just like a listening conference call.
Yeah.
And we're able to, jot down, okay, they had 10 points, these were their 10 concerns. We're able to say, okay, we can definitely give on 3 of the 10, we can meet them in the middle on 3 of the 10, and some of them, might just be absolute no's, but this is what we can do, and hey, we've met you halfway on this one, we've given on this one, and this is what we'd like to do.
And you do that internally or across the table or both?
This is, we'll have another call internally to discuss it.
Yeah, I think that's best practice.
And then also on the front end, sometimes before the listening meeting,
Yeah.
we receive comments that we get on call and, you were saying, hey, you got to establish roles before you get on a call. I'm going to sit back, let the attorney and the leasing agent kind of drive the call. Y'all talk, I kind of cop, bad cop, kind of deal. Listen, they can say no, and when I'm listening and hearing what their true concern was when they redline something, you're like, why did they redline this? This doesn't make any sense. When you hear the rationale, you're like, oh, okay, well, this is what we can do. I understand what you meant by that.
Yeah.
Now we can kind of have a meeting of the minds.
Nice. I'll say, I was going to mention it earlier, but later, but I'll say it because you mentioned it. This idea of good cop, bad cop. I mean, it's such a well-known tool, and I like it with the caveat of if it comes naturally to you and your counterpart, your teammate, then by all means, good cop, bad cop works, and it sounds like it works for you to be the kind of instinctively good cop. I will say, though, that it's such a well-known tool that if it doesn't come instinctively, it sometimes gets called out in the room, and the other times, hey, stop playing good cop, bad cop, let's get serious here. My recommendation, I think, is related to what you said a minute ago. Rather than good cop, bad cop, consider having a leader and a listener. We talked already about having a single channel of communication. If you've got a leader of the discussion, that person can be the one who makes the principle back and forth across the table, and you've got a listener whose job it is to really listen to what the other side is saying and maybe report back in a sidebar. What I thought was interesting about what you said was, by playing the role of listener, and I'm paraphrasing what you said, you're able to kind of take a step back and to interject in a more constructive way. So it's not like you're playing a secondary role. You're actually playing a very active role and a very important role, but it's from a kind of a counterintuitive, right? We'd say the person running the meeting should be the senior person in the room. Well, maybe not so. Maybe the more tactical person should be leading the meeting, and you can have the benefit of sitting back and thinking about more broader issues and problems.
And the reason is because we've already discussed where we stand in terms of how to respond.
Yeah.
And so we've already discussed, okay, this is how,
Yeah.
But if during that call I'm listening and I really understand things a bit clearer from the tenant standpoint, then I'm okay sometimes with jumping in and saying, hey, I'm okay with that, but let's craft it,
Yeah.
you know, our attorney will craft the language to something that's a little.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you, it is a real counterintuitive move to say, I deliberately want to take a step back and let others do the hard work for me, but can be very powerful in the room to let somebody else do the heavy lifting. It gives you some flexibility to really step back and think more broadly. Sounds like you do that well. I will also say that there's a real cultural divide, as I observe it. In the US, the leader of the negotiation tends to be the more senior person. When I go to Asia, it's the reverse. And it goes to what you said. The most powerful person in the room will oftentimes say nothing. And they'll sit there quietly. Some of it is language issues, so admittedly that's part of the problem. But when you've got a senior person sitting there, you know they're the decision maker, and they're saying nothing at all, that's very powerful. It's almost intimidating because they're so powerful, they don't say anything. You know, they just have others do the work for them. So I do urge you to think about roles, good cop, bad cop. Sometimes that's okay. A different kind of role assignment is leader, listener, which I think can be very powerful for the reason that you say. I'll say the physical environment. You know, what's interesting is we all know it matters, and yet we don't think about it carefully enough, and we don't manage the physical environment to communicate a joint problem-solving approach. We don't use the physical space to try to achieve the objectives we want to reach. I learned this the hard way, and I'll give you my hard way example in a second. But I'll tell you, and Gail can confirm this, every session like this that I don't do them that often, I will go to the room in advance, and I'll try to figure out how can we shape the physical space. Is Gail still, where is Gail? Gail's here. Yeah, so Gail, can you confirm this and tell me if I'm missing something, but is it fair to say when we first came in here this morning, the tables were, stretched all through the room? And if you think about the discussion we've had today, I would suggest that discussion would have been impossible had we had that physical layout. So it's important. We all know it's important. The implication is manage the physical space. Use the physical space to communicate a joint problem-solving approach. For example, sitting on the same side of the table can be very powerful. I tell you, there are certain service providers, architects, service providers who deliberately will say, we want to intersperse with our client, our prospective client, because we want to communicate to them that we are literally embedded in their organization. It's not us presenting to you, it is us trying to solve the problem that you have together. So that to me is best practice. I'll give you my counterexample. This is kind of a hard way of learning this point, but I'll tell you, about 5 years ago now, there was a corporate board that was evenly divided on a major decision called the yellow strategy versus the purple strategy. Tensions were running very high. I got forwarded the email chain among the directors, and there were all caps emails saying, you can't be serious when you say X, Y, Z. So there was a lot of tension. I was asked to moderate this discussion, and it was being held at the outside counsel's office in DC, just to illustrate how severe the tension had gotten. And here was the mistake, and I take some blame for this mistake. The board members were asked to pick up their name cards and take a seat as they entered the meeting. So what do you expect happens? Here's the boardroom table. And by the way, this is a pretty well-known company. If I told you the name of the company, everyone would know it. What would happen? So outside counsel shows up first. It's kind of his room, so he sits there. A yellow shows up, he sits there. A purple shows up, he sits there. What do you see happening? Paralegal shows up, sits at the end of the table. Board chairman's a purple, he sits at the head along with the outside counsel. I show up, I'm asked to sit next to the outside counsel. He in some ways has brought me in. The meeting's about to begin. It's 7:58. Meeting begins at 8 o'clock, and we're set up in this kind of war kind of way, with the yellows on this side and the purples on this side. And yeah, Gail, you're shaking your head.
I move them around.
You move them around? I was asking, and Gail, you preempted my question, what would you do? And you would say, everybody get up, we're going to move around? You're braver than me, Gail, because these are all...
Or I would say, let's go have coffee, so you can break the thing up, or in advance, put name tags. Sometimes I do that.
Yes.
In advance, put name tags so you mix up people who have different points of view, but they need to talk to each other.
Right. No, I 100% agree that had I really thought it through in advance, I should have and could have put out name cards in advance.
But you're in that situation, and you see it's already done. You walk in the room. I would suggest that we either take a break and go get coffee or have a restroom break. Think of some way to break that up so that when they come back in the room, you've got a way to see them.
And they would move your chair right out.
And I don't care if they will be upset about it.
These are all captains of industry. I mean, these are directors of a major company. Go ahead. Any other thoughts? The meeting's about to begin. It's 7:58. Meeting's about to begin. We're all seated in our chairs. What do you do?
What's wrong also with putting your cards on the table and saying, okay, we're on opposite sides here, but we want to have a blended meeting, so let's all get up and play musical chairs and reseat each other so we can have a cohesive discussion.
Again, you're braver than me.
Okay, of course we're braver.
I would not be brave enough for that, but I would, if I were you,
Yeah.
I would move
Yeah.
to sit next to the paralegal if
Okay.
possible.
Okay.
Just for the perception of neutrality if you're a moderator.
Okay. All right. Yeah. I mean, look, that's what I was concerned about. I've been brought in by the outside counsel and by this purple over here. And so I was certainly concerned, to be an effective mediator, I need to be physically reaching out to both sides, and I can't do that from where I'm sitting in the room. The idea of perfectly reasonable to say, let's all move around on chairs. I just be clear, that there wasn't as if they were all wearing purple T-shirts and yellow T-shirts, right? It was a little more subtle than what I'm putting on the screen. Any other thoughts on what you would do? Switch spots with the paralegal. Okay.
You were asked to sit by outside counsel.
I was asked to sit next to outside counsel, yeah.
I think that, you gave the example of the Duke Energy guy coming into the room and having some opening remark that really diffused the tension.
Help me understand what's going on here.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess you're not going to get up and move a bunch of people around in a meeting once they're already sitting down.
Okay.
In reality. So, having some sort of opening statement that diffuses the tension in the room and makes clear that you're there to have everybody work collaboratively together to try to solve the problem.
Okay, all right. Any other ideas, Gail? And then we'll take one.
I really want to encourage you to think about that people are human beings regardless of which side of the issue they're on. So sometimes just the ability to get them to stand up and laugh or move, or it breaks the tension, and you have to really understand they don't want to be tense any more than you want them to be tense. They don't want to sit there and feel uncomfortable.
No.
And yes, it's true that they're immersed in their opinion and their strategy, but you do have to break that tension, and you have to be willing to do that with them.
Sure.
So I guess I'm just saying, don't be afraid of them. They are humans, just like everybody else.
Last, by the way, I was very afraid of them, so I guess. Two last comments.
I just think I would, I don't know, if I was you, I would approach maybe one of the yellows individually and just say, may I ask you to switch there, and then maybe even another one, and kind of accomplish your mix with just a one-on-one. Because I think it's harder to say, no, I'm not moving, than,
Last idea.
If I'm you, I would get up and I would conduct the meeting standing up, and I'd go, if you can't get them to move, and I'd go back and forth to both sides of the table.
I had that thought, and in fact, there's a movie where Robert De Niro walks around the table with a baseball bat. that image crossed my mind because I had the same idea, and he was like a mob guy, I think, in the movie. So anyway, I had that idea.
How did it work?
Well, I tell you, here's what I did, and this is not good or bad. It's just what I did. I said, this was those ergonomic chairs with 12 different controls. I said, you know what, my chair's not working. And I got up and I moved. And someone said, I moved and sat next to the paralegal. So I kind of made an excuse and said, my chair's not working. I went and sat next to the paralegal. I want to emphasize, I don't think this was a brilliant idea. I do think that Gail is right to say I should have at the outset worked with the outside counsel to put out name cards in advance, maybe alphabetical, but whatever it is, you do it in advance. In my defense, maybe I could say that this was the outside counsel meeting, it wasn't my meeting, so maybe. But I should have been prepared for this kind of a possibility, because we know human nature is going to be such that the yellows will hit the yellows, purples will hit the yellows, and I was a bit of a stuck situation.
Well, and because I've walked into one of these.
Yeah.
I was sitting in the middle of that yellow, and I had a big red bullseye on the back of my head.
Yep.
Coming from the other side, and people, when they walk into that meeting, where you sit says something about your intention.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
And to even think that you're going to budge anybody out of the seat that they intentionally selected, even if it was subconscious.
Yes, no, I
They're
agree.
picking their space on purpose.
I agree, and I would say 100% right that this was not a coincidence,
No.
and this was not a coincidence, but I think Gail's point is equally important. You want to preempt that.
If you can.
If you can, and so just general point of visualizing the physical space and managing it to your advantage to convey the substance message you want to convey. Because you're 100% right, the physical space conveys good or bad. And I'll tell you, we wanted to achieve certain things in this group, we moved the tables accordingly. Likewise, in a situation like this, you want to achieve certain things, use the physical space to your advantage. Yeah?
Don't you also have to know your audience, though, as well? I mean, if you handed these, I'm assuming mostly men.
All men.
You know, if you set the table, so to speak,
Yeah.
and put their name cards out,
Yeah.
they're going to feel free to move them.
Yeah.
You know,
Sure,
so, I mean,
right.
There is. I
Yeah.
agree with the strategy, but I also think your move to be in the sort of neutral position,
Yeah.
really the most realistic thing that's going to happen in that particular room.
Fair enough. Let me just mention what happened. It was kind of interesting. The meeting begins at 8 o'clock. The chairman calls to order. This yellow raises his hand at 8:01, and he says, with all due respect to the professor, I'd like the motion for him to be excluded from our meeting. Okay, so I left. 45 minutes later, the chairman called. He comes out of the hallway and says, okay, you're in. And
Oh, you have no idea what's been going on.
we had no idea what was going on. I mean, clearly, in this yellow's defense, he thought I had been brought in by this purple to be a shill for the purple side. That wasn't my objective, but clearly the physical space of the outfit had communicated that to him. We had a long, drawn-out, hard-fought discussion over the course of the day. We did at lunchtime, we did change our seats around, in part because this purple said during the meeting, he said, you know what, I feel like we're at war with each other. Let's try to be working together in a civil way and not dissolve the board. That was the bat, and it was dissolution of the board. He said we can do better than that. We did move around the chairs. 6 p.m. that night, 6:30 p.m., we got to a deal. So it was a kind of yellow plus purple kind of strategy, as you might expect after a good negotiation. We had drinks at the local bar that night because most people had missed their flights to go home. And what was striking is the same yellow, he turned to me at the bar and he said, you know what? I got great comfort from the fact that you moved your chair. Because he said to me, I was concerned about where you were sitting, and when you moved your chair, that signaled to me that we're going to work hard on this problem together. And I thought that was interesting, because we all know it to be true. The physical space matters. But notice, I had moved my chair out of an excuse. I said my chair's not working, I'm moving my chair. I was trying to make it a non-substantive thing, but he clearly read substance into my move. So again, it just illustrates the general point. I've learned my lesson. This was 5 years ago. I learned my lesson. Always go to the room early. Always arrange it in a way that signals what you're trying to achieve out of the negotiation. All right, any last comments? All right, so physical space matters. In the room, it's interesting to me how there's lots of books, and I can recommend them if you like during the drinks party. Talk about micro-expressions. Micro-expressions are eyebrow flickers and things like that. They tend to be hard to read. And I would offer that if you're focusing on the micro-expressions, you're not really focusing where the action is in the negotiations. My recommendation is, focus on the macro-expressions. So in general, open body language is better than closed body language. Now, I will caveat this by saying this may be gendered. I think that open body language is generally a better thing. I'm not sure how translatable it is, and you'll have to tell me where I'm wrong. But in general, communicating an openness to the situation is better than closed body language. And in general, arms crossed can be a very significant signal of adversarial approaches in negotiation. I'll mention that some people say, you know what, I just feel more comfortable with my arms crossed. This is just the way I'm comfortable. And I'll say, tough, don't do it. Because closed body language, whether you mean to or not, signals across cultures, I'm not going to work with you on the problem. You want open body language instead. So definitely, this is not meant to be a political signal. I'm trying to give you across the aisle. But I already picked these pictures out. I put them in there. But look, pointing fingers, crossed arms, we all know this to be true. Sometimes you want to use these kinds of macro expressions, but if you're going to do it, do so deliberately. Know what you're doing. Don't just fall into this kind of behavior without knowing the signal you're sending across the table. So it's not meant to be out of the toolkit. You want to keep it in the toolkit, but use it selectively. It is the equivalent of playing the X card. So use it, but use it sparingly. Use it only when you have to.
And if you go back one of the things that I've learned too in the eye contact when you're in a room where there's negotiation, the negotiating party is making eye contact with who they think is the decision maker. I've literally had to, I have had to, after an initial meeting, and I've had my male colleague with me, I have literally had to ask him to stay out of the room. Because I couldn't get engaged with the other party, because no matter what that other person's position was, he and he were engaged, and he and she weren't having a conversation until he left the room.
Yeah, you know, it's very troubling. I mean, what to say? I don't know what to say with that.
That was what I said. You need to stay out for a
To your colleague?
Yes. You
Now,
give me 10 minutes with this so that I can get us engaged in this dialogue. I have to leave the room.
well, look, I would offer another solution, and we'll talk about this in our last 20 minutes. Another solution would be to say to your counterparty across the table, you know what? I feel like I need to be part of this negotiation. I am part of my team, and I would appreciate if we had a collective discussion and not just have eye contact between you and him. Now, I don't say this casually, but some cases to name the game is very important when you've got this kind of situation
Well,
going
and
on.
the interesting, and I'm saying this is a conversation that we have together, because we're the team on the one side, away from the person who's, I don't think really realizes that that's what he's doing. I think it's an unconscious thing, and it's a dialogue that he's having with somebody who's actually a subordinate of mine, but it's just, I don't know if it's a generational, is where I've seen it mostly with older men who assume.
Yeah, you know, I do think, I mean, look, you gotta call it in the room, but I would say that in some cases, if you name the game and describe what you're experiencing in the situation, ideally what your counterparty will say is, you know what, I'm very sorry, I didn't mean to do that, I will certainly try to be better about that going forward. Now, I don't offer it casually, but in some cases, that's the right thing to do, is to call it out, because the alternative of allowing these kinds of practices to go on, I think, is just not something we collectively want to do. And I'll just, as an example, I'll just mention, and we're not going to talk about cultural issues today, but I can certainly recommend books on culture if you'd like. I'll tell you, just as a recent example, one of my participants in A&P, one of the very few women, as I mentioned, in A&P this past cohort, we had a session on culture negotiation. She's a German woman. She's a very senior person in her company. She leads a team of negotiators. They went to Tokyo, Japan to negotiate a deal. They get in the night before, they check into the hotel. One of her subordinates gets a call that evening on his hotel phone from the other side, Tokyo businessman. And the Tokyo guy says, we'd feel more comfortable in this negotiation if you left, let's call her Jill, out of the room for our negotiation tomorrow. What do? You know, he reports back to his boss, Jill, and they have a meeting that evening, and they say, what should we do? And it's a real question. I don't know what's the right answer. I can tell you it was a very significant deal for the German company. They needed the Japanese company more than the Japanese company needed them. And so it would be easy for the German company to say, fine, you know, this time, maybe only this once, we'll leave Jill out of the room, we'll report back to her, and we'll kind of make progress that way. To their credit, they didn't do that. They said, you know what, if you don't want Jill in the room, we'll all go home. And the Japanese side, they, quote, caved, and they allowed, and again, in quotes, allowed Jill to be in the room. The negotiation went forward, they got to a deal and so on. But I do think, and we'll talk about this in our final 20 minutes, I do think that some proactive, carefully done steps on both women and men can help solve some of these things that we're talking about here today.
Why did they want her excluded?
Oh man, I mean, this is a longer story. For anyone who's done business in Japan, and I don't want to single out Japanese men, but maybe I will for this purpose, they tend to be very gendered. And the Japanese business culture is incredibly male-dominated. I tell you, I was in Tokyo a few months ago, and it was very striking how we'd have dinner, starts at 8 o'clock p.m. We would have dinner, we'd go on and on and on. 11 p.m., I'd say to the Japanese men, aren't you going home at some point to see your families? And I say, you know what, we have very small apartments here in the city. Our families live 2 hours away. On Friday nights, we take the bullet train home to our families. But other than that, our jobs are our lives. Now, look, I'm a little bit stereotyping here, but not that much, in the sense that it is a very male-dominated culture, and this whole idea of work-life balance and equality of the gender just doesn't exist. as I observe it in Japan, in the kind of traditional Japanese-style companies. Now, it is getting better, it is changing, but it's awfully slow. And I think the dynamic that you're describing, that I'm describing, is just one manifestation where careful interventions can be a way of pushing people more quickly than they might otherwise want to go. All right, I kind of digress because this was a good example, but let me just say a few more things and then talk about gender negotiation. Mirroring, again, not to be taken literally, but to be taken seriously. And in general, what do you see? When people start to engage well with each other, they start to mirror each other physically. So here's some of my MBA students in the beginning of a negotiation exercise. And you can see they're fairly standoffish, but very quickly, as they begin to make progress on the problem, they start to mirror each other. Now again, I don't mean this to be taken literally. It would be silly for you to be mirroring everything they're doing in the room. But to be aware, if they're leaning forward, you want to lean forward as well. If they're leaning back, maybe you want to consider mirroring that behavior as well. Being aware that in general, when you're making connections on the substance of the deal, you start to mirror each other physically as well. In general, what are you trying to achieve? We've talked about this over the course of the day. There is this traditional model of me versus you, the adversarial mindset of you play X cards and I play X cards. And if you think I'm sort of making this up and no one really thinks this way, let me offer, and I don't think anyone's at this firm, but maybe they are. Bingham & McCutcheon is a pretty well-known Boston firm, Boston, San Francisco. And here's an ad they ran a few years ago. It says at the top, in litigation, getting what you want is everything. And there's a crying baby. And in the small print, it talks about how we are going to beat the other side beyond recognition to achieve what you, the client, want for yourself. I know some of the partners at Bingham in Boston. It's a pretty big Boston firm. And they were appalled by this ad. They were horrified by it. And they said, this is not how we want to portray ourselves to the world. This is not what good lawyers do. They don't play this. What do? They're playing much more along the lines of, let's solve the problem for our clients. And they changed their ad. So for what it's worth, Bingham changed its ad to, great partnerships share common goals, and there's a small dog sitting on top of a big dog to get to the cookie jar, and the small text talks all about how we're going to work together with opposing counsel, not at the expense of zealous advocacy, no, but to really try to solve the problem as effectively as we can for you and your counterparty's benefit. So, to me, this very subtle conceptualization of what the negotiation is about. Is it, on one hand, Bill Johnson, just to use a name, pound the table, scream and yell? Or is it the Jim Rogers, help me understand what's going on here? To me, this is a better approach in general, because you can always go the other direction if you have to. You can always go back to here. It is very difficult to come in guns blazing and then say, okay, let's try to sort this out. Comments or questions, thoughts? Okay. So I'll say a few last things and then turn to gender. Active listening, like I've said earlier, great negotiators may or may not be good talkers, but great negotiators are always great listeners, and they can hear what the other side is saying. Active listening is a tool, I would say, most negotiators most of the time are not using this tool often enough. It involves paraphrasing what you hear them saying, inquiring, asking open-ended questions like we've been talking about over the course of the day, acknowledging sometimes hidden emotions or core interests. Here's some examples of each one. I won't go through them. But notice in general what you're trying to do. Number one, really hear what they're saying. Not necessarily agree, but hear what they're saying. And number two, communicating to them that you're listening to what they're saying. And all the research on trust and relationship, how do you build trust in negotiation, is actually not that hard in the sense of when people feel listened to, they're far more likely to trust you. Now again, you're not agreeing with what they have to say, but acknowledging I'm listening to you, I hear what you're saying, that to me is best practices and it allows you to build trust in a negotiation. Some further quotes on this. Henry Ford, if there's any secret to success, it lies in being able to get the other person's point of view and see things from that person's angle as well as your own. Here's this, when I go to Asia, they said, we've known this for years, Professor. Ancient Chinese proverb, seek first to understand and then be understood. And notice the sequence matters. Seek first to understand. Don't go to the room and try to persuade them of the wisdom of your point of view. You can do that, but first, seek first to understand, and only then be understood. So the sequence does matter. Here's President Obama. This isn't meant to be a political statement, but I'll offer it to you for what it is. Here's Barack Obama says, the way I think about interacting with people generally is to find out what they're thinking, so the same sequence you just saw, give them a sense for what I'm thinking, and try to synthesize and try to find the truth that lies between people. I'll tell you, I read this in the New York Times 6 or 7 years ago, and I had a flashback to the mid-1990s when I was an editor of the Harvard Law Review, and people would talk about this guy, Barack Obama. And people said, this guy, Barack Obama, he will be president someday. There's no doubt he will be president. And at the time, he was a state senator in Illinois, and I'd say, why this guy? How come this guy's so special? And people who knew him, he was only a few years ahead of me, people would say, this guy, Barack Obama, he could really listen to people, and he could navigate his way to a deal in the Harvard Law Review like nobody else around him. And that struck me because there's a lot of people at Harvard Law School who are great talkers, but there are very few who are good listeners. And Obama was known for being a good listener. In general, cognitive perspective taking, the ability to take their point of view, not agree with it, but take their point of view, is correlated with negotiation skills, leadership skills. When you ask great negotiators, what's the single one thing you can do to be a good negotiator? It is the ability to really see things from their perspective. Not agree, but understand what they're doing and why they're doing it. Questions or comments? I'll tell you, we've had a long day, a high energy day. If there's one thing you should take away from this entire day, it would be this. Active listening is so powerful, and when it's done well, it is truly masterful. I don't want to say this is literally what you should be doing. No, obviously you've got to tailor the approach for the context. But to go to the room with the mindset of, let's solve the problem. Let me hear from you. That's what great negotiators are doing all the time in the room. Okay. What are you looking for? Well, when you're asking questions, it's really differences. Differences in, so for example, some real estate examples, free rent, landlord work allowances, force majeure clauses. These are all the things, installment sales, options, right of first refusal. You can see how all these different tools can be in the negotiator's toolkit. Many of you deployed those tools in the quick cash exercise, so I know you know all this, but what you're looking for in the room is differences. What's valuable for them, what's cheap for you to give, that's the source of value creation in negotiation. Just as an example of this last one, options, right of first refusal, that can be a real source of value creation. I'll offer a kind of personal example based on a deal from a few years ago. 2011, a guy named Sipal Singh Awalia was in negotiations to sell his company to our company, LKQ, based in Chicago, for between 200 and 300 million pounds. There was a big gap in the ask and the offer. Here's a picture of him. A remarkable guy. He's a self-made entrepreneur in the UK. He built his company from nothing. He lived right under the runways at Heathrow Airport for 30 years. He built his company from nothing. He was a Uganda refugee from Idi Amin, came along with nothing. And now I was quite struck because he was ready to walk away from 200 million pounds because his company he thought was worth 300 million pounds. And there were numerous meetings in London where he would say, you know what, a dime less than 300 million pounds and I'm out of here. And we would say, you know, Sipal, your company's not worth that much. We don't believe it's going to grow the way you're talking about. 200 million is the best and final offer we can make. So a real breakdown. In the end, we got to a contingent deal. It was a big earn-out in which we gave him 225 right away, and then a further 55. He met growth targets for 2012 and 2013. Now, earn-outs, these are used sometimes. I don't think they're a tool of first resort, but as a tool of last resort, they can be a way of bridging valuation gaps. And notice, you deployed them in the quick cash exercise by having contingencies. If you want the first floor, here's an option on the first floor. Those kinds of forks in the road can be quite useful, and they're, again, a source of value creation in these kinds of situations. By the way, any guesses on whether he hit his growth targets? It's now 2016. Yes. He blew through his targets. He crushed it. And in fact, we paid him his $55 million early because he had crushed it so hard. In other words, he was right, we were wrong on what his company was worth. Why were we thrilled to pay him 55 million pounds?
He's still under the
He created multiples of that for LKQ, and so we were thrilled to pay him 55 million. So notice, contingent deals like this have the benefit that in the scenario where the payoff is made, it is very cheap money. So it's kind of a nice way of bridging valuation gaps. Again, it's not a tool of first resort, but it can be sometimes a tool of last resort, these kinds of contingencies and kinds of forks in the road.
But he accepted less than 300, which he threw down his.
Right.
Yeah, so look, I mean, and we paid more than 200, which is what we say would only pay in the room. So, we both gave a little bit. But you're right, in the end, what did he get? 280. He's doing perfectly fine. Just don't. By the way, I just mentioned, he is currently building the second largest house in the entire London, in all of London. He's building the second largest house. So he's doing about tenement housing under Heathrow Airport, now the second largest house in London. The first largest house being Buckingham Palace. So it's remarkable how well he's done. And I give him great credit. Yeah?
Did you negotiate what that target was? Did he give you the number, or did you
heavily negotiated what the target was. And look, there's a whole science to earnouts. But I will say, because I tell you, the target was set in a very careful way to be about new store openings. So he had a growth pattern, we had a growth expectation. We said if you hit your growth in terms of store openings, we'll pay you the earnout. But it was heavily negotiated. So for example, he would propose the store openings, but back in Chicago, we'd have to approve them. Another feature was, he said, fine, I'll take your earnout, but I've got to run Europe. For these 2 years, I'm going to run Europe because he didn't want us messing with his company while he was having earnout. So that'd be very carefully structured. But in that context, it was the only way to get it done. And in the end, it worked out to be a so-called classic win-win negotiation. Okay, I want to turn to our gender topic. So I'm going to skip this because it's pretty self-explanatory. The bottom line is there are these psychological biases that you can use to kind of shape the perception of the ZOPA and to try to maximize the odds that they'll accept your deal. So please do look it over. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. If you want to talk about it, I'm happy to talk about it at any point. There's also a lot of detail about these biases in my book as well. I should say one just general word about them. There's lots of so-called biases, psychological biases in the academic literature. A lot of them I don't take too seriously because they're based on experimental evidence with undergraduate students. Things like anchoring, framing, these kinds of effects do work. I take them very seriously. What I've tried to offer to you is the subset that I think really do work in practice. So take a look at them as you see fit, and I'm happy to discuss it as you'd like. I want to say just a couple things and then turn to gender because we only have about 15 minutes left. In general, we've talked about this all throughout the day, but in general, this is what good negotiation sounds like. It starts in a positive way. It frames the negotiation at the outset as, let's try to figure out how to unlock a lot of value here and make sure that each one of us gets a fair piece of pie. Not me versus you, but the two of us trying to solve the problem. You have paraphrasing. It sounds like you have inquiring, asking open-ended questions, contingent concessions. If we did this, then would you be willing to do that? Not that I can do this, but if we did, could you do that? So tying explicitly your concession to their concession. What if? I tell you, having been involved in lots of negotiations and having observed great negotiators, these two words, what if, they're very powerful. They're a real way of signaling very subtly, I'm trying to work with you. I'm trying to brainstorm with you how we're going to move forward together. What if we did this? Maybe it works for you, maybe it works for me. Let's try to think through what that looks like. If they make an aggressive proposal, help me understand how you got to that because that's not in the right zip code. And then finally, if there's still an impasse, is there some process we can agree to that can help us get to an objectively fair resolution? Maybe that's bringing the principals in, maybe that's bringing a third party in. That kind of process solution is a last resort if all else fails. All right, I want to turn in our last few minutes to gender negotiation. It is obviously a heavily discussed topic. It is in the news on a pretty regular basis. Here's just one example. We've alluded to this pay gap all throughout the day, but I'll offer a kind of fun example of this from a couple years ago. Satya Nadella, the no longer new, but at this point relatively new CEO of Microsoft, he was asked in a company-wide conference what advice he would give women who don't feel comfortable asking their boss for a raise. And he said, quote, "It's not really about asking for the raise, but knowing and having faith that the system will actually give you the right raises as you go along." This was not well received. It was a firestorm on the internet and so on. And I think it's fair that he was a new CEO at the time, and he was a bit blindsided by this comment. by the way, I don't think he's a sexist person. I don't think he's he's a relatively progressive CEO. I think he was genuinely trying to do the right thing, but he was blindsided. So this shows you how even people who are well-meaning can be blind to the issue of gender gap, pay gap, and the things that one ought to be thinking about as the CEO of Microsoft. So he sent an email, company-wide email, to all 100,000, maybe more than that, 200,000 employees. Without a doubt, I wholeheartedly support programs at Microsoft and in the industry that bring more women in technology and close the pay gap. I answered that question completely wrong. If you think you deserve a raise, you should just ask. So, a little vignette on the challenges and difficulties that companies face and that you face as female negotiators. There's also, close to home, Boston is offering negotiation classes for women. This 79% number you see a lot. I think it's around 70 to 80% is the pay gap that you see in a lot of the empirical studies. 90,000 women over the next 5 years. Let me offer, in a nutshell, what I see as being the relevant research on this topic. The bottom line for me is that at every phase of the negotiation process, preparation, pre-negotiation, aspirations, process, outcomes, you see significant differences between men and women. Again, with the caveat that these are huge populations we're talking about, and these are long distributions and with long tails. For the engineers here, you'll appreciate that. But, having said that, there are very meaningful differences. As we talked about already, men are more likely to view business situations as decisions and therefore negotiable, rather than decisions that have been made. For example, men are more likely to negotiate salary and employment negotiations. There was some striking research done at Kellogg, a pretty well-known business school in Chicago, where they controlled for the kind of job people were going into, everything else you might think of. Men were much more likely to negotiate their first job offer than were women. And you think about the pay gap and the 79% and so on, a lot of that gap can be attributed to that initial fork in the road. In other words, if you're a 28-year-old MBA, you negotiate your pay package, you get 5% more. Doesn't take a lot. And then you just start at 3% a year for 20 years, and you've got a pretty big pay gap. So little differences early on can explain a lot of the pay gap. In this particular study of Kellogg MBAs, the men were far more likely to negotiate their first job than were women. I don't want to cold call, and I wish I could, because this was a great comment somebody made during the break about the internal budget negotiation. Does anyone want to confess to that comment? I thought it was a great observation about how some people will negotiate, perceive that internal. I'm sorry to.
That's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm the president of the company, and we issue raise guidance to our managers, and our managers come back and say we recommend these raises for different people. And some of them just said, here's the raises I recommend. And others said, here's the raises I recommend, but they, in their minds, thought it was a negotiation. So they went higher than the other said. And I didn't realize it was a negotiation.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to understand when you're in a negotiation room, it's just, here's what we are recommending.
And is it, I hope we can have a candid conversation. I thought it was such an interesting point. And then was it right to say that the person said to you, I asked for 6%, but I only wanted 4%, and I was surprised when you get
You were going to talk me down, so I went for 6.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, how many people did that?
Yeah.
So it's interesting.
You know, I do think it is accurate, as a matter of the research, that women underestimate the category of cases that are negotiable. I think it's also fair to say that men probably overestimate. But notice, when you overestimate, what happens? You get corrected, right? I'm sorry, that's not negotiable. You get corrected. When you underestimate, you don't negotiate a situation which you could have, should have negotiated, what happens? You never get corrected. You never find out. Now, your example is kind of extraordinary, where the person actually said, I only wanted 4 and I got 6. But in the most of the world, you don't find out. And so there is this systematic bias over time where men will push, and figure out where the limits are. Women, in general, on average, don't push as much, and as a result, they never really figure out where the limits are, and they consistently underestimate what's negotiable, what's not. Men set higher aspirations than women in negotiations. Both men and women set higher aspirations against women. So, for example, in a pure price negotiation at Harvard Business School, we have sometimes given them their counterparty the night before. And so they know the person's name at least, they can figure out gender pretty easily. And men and women both set higher aspirations when they're negotiating with a woman. Boys and girls are equally overconfident through second grade. Then boys remain overconfident, especially on math, while girls start to underestimate their abilities. It's quite striking that this is something that is somehow cultural, I guess. And notice the phrasing. They're equally overconfident, meaning they're both wrong. Boys and girls are both wrong. They are overconfident, but after second grade, girls get it right. They're sort of saying, yeah, we're about average on average, which is true. But boys continue to be overconfident, which I do think is related to the top finding. Women are more likely to ask about the other's needs. Men are more likely to be about persuasion. Men, as we talked about earlier, men are more willing to distinguish the negotiation from relationships. Women are less likely to do so. So we talked about this morning. Men say, you know what, it's nothing personal. It's just business. And in business, I got to do what's right for my organization. Women are less likely to be able to disentangle the personal from the business. Men claim more value than women in pure price deals. But women are more likely to find value than are men. Now, this goes to the earlier point. Men are more likely to play the X card in general, on average. Women are more likely to play the Y card. So notice, if you're playing Y cards and your counterparty is as well, you're going to find the value. When you're playing X cards, you're going to get more value, but the pie is likely to be smaller than if you had some more nuanced combination of X's and Y's. So neither one is right or wrong. It's just to say that there are these biases or central tendencies, and you want to be aware of what those tendencies might be. Again, similar to what we've already said, men place a greater value in economic outcomes, women place greater value in relational outcomes, and then finally, we talked about this morning, I think this may be the most striking finding, most of these differences go away if women are acting as agents for others. And so one of the recommendations that I'll offer in a second is to try to conceptualize your role as a negotiator as being on behalf of your family, your organization, your law firm, for society overall. In Sheryl Sandberg's book, she says women should negotiate on behalf of all women. And not just that, on behalf of all society, because men benefit as well when there's a more equal workplace for everybody. So these are some of the findings from the research. I have a little bit more to say, but take comments, yeah.
I think there's a lot from actually understanding how the system works. And in my role, I spend a lot of time managing people. That's what I do now. I manage people all over the place. And when you understand the system, like what you said, you end up with, in the real world, there's an amount of money that you get each year to apply to all the people that work with you for you. And you will never give it to the person that doesn't ask.
Yeah.
So if somebody comes in and asks for a raise, then all of a sudden you'll, oh, okay, well, maybe I can do a little bit here, a little bit there. But if you know somebody is never going to ask or going to accept whatever you give them, you take the easiest road, usually.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, you try to manage people correctly, but I just don't think people realize how powerful the ask is.
Right.
And someone has to tell you no.
Yeah, I mean, it goes to this first point. You know, men are more likely to view the whole process as being negotiable, whereas women. I would urge you to think about or consider a book by my colleague at Carnegie Mellon, Linda Babcock, who's done a lot of research on gender negotiation, and I can send her out some proposed readings after the session. She has a very compelling book called, and the title says it all, Women Don't Ask. That's the title of the book. And I would urge you to think about it, because it is striking how this kind of fork in the road can exist at the very earliest stage when you don't even think about it as being a negotiation. I'll mention, as a professor at Harvard for 15 years now, I was struck early on in my career about how students would come into office hours during the exam time and during the kind of grading time. Now, the rule at Harvard for 400 years is once a grade is fixed, once a grade is submitted to the system, you can't change the grade. 100% you can't change the grade unless there was some kind of error. If you did the math wrong, you can change the grade, but once it's fixed, you can't change it. The students know this, and the students know it's not going to be negotiable after the professor submits the grade. So I was struck early on in my career how the men would come into my office, and what would they say? I really loved your course. I thought it'd be very important for me professionally and personally, and by the way, professor, I'm on the cusp of being a Baker Scholar. Now, Baker Scholar is our top honor, and if you get to be Baker Scholar, there's all kinds of good things. And look, you try not to be influenced by that, but when I'm giving out the grades and Joe is on the cusp of being a Baker Scholar, it is just human nature to say, gosh, I'd love Joe to be a Baker Scholar, I know Joe, I'm going to give him a 1, which is the top grade. Now, what does that mean? Someone else gets a 2. And if the women are less in your office than are the men, they're going to be bearing the brunt of Joe being proactive about it. Now, I do my humanly best possible thing of avoiding that kind of bias, but I do think it's human nature, and I think some of the comments illustrate the point that viewing situations as being negotiable, at least at the margin, is an important piece of the toolkit, and men on average are more likely to do that than are women. Okay, this is all very depressing, so I'm going to try to move behind us. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I'd like to ask about the aspirations, expectations, that first paragraph, especially the second part, where it says that both men and women set higher aspirations against women.
Right.
Can you explain that?
Yeah. So the first part of it is that seems straightforward, consistent with overall kind of societal norms. But what's striking is that it turns on the identity of the other side, not so much on your side. So I guess the way to put it is both men and women are biased against women. I mean, in some funny way.
We're more likely to give.
Well, hold on. No, let's say I'm negotiating with Sally. I'm a man. I would say, I think I can get the deal for 40, okay? And that's a pretty good price. A woman on the same side of the table as me has the same reaction. Now it's less, it's mitigated a little bit, but there's still a difference in terms of men and women both thinking they can get a better deal when a woman is across the table. Does that make sense? I mean, I hope I explained it. Okay, so that's the finding. And it does suggest to me that it's a very subtle problem. It is something about societal norms. It's not some kind of inherent, fundamental sexist bias, because you would assume that women are not going to be biased in that kind of overt way. It is something much more subtle and maybe cultural or societal that causes this second effect. So we get it when we say men are going to set higher aspirations. When women do the same thing, that kind of puts a twist on it. Yeah?
The second paragraph of that aspirations, expectations, about boys remain overconfident while girls continue to underestimate their abilities.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure that it's societal as much as it might be inherent, innate. Because having watched children, girls and boys being raised similarly, like in conscious effort to be similar, you still see that same distinction between the way the girls behave and the boys behave.
I'm laughing because my president got fired for saying something very similar to what you just said. Larry Summers was our president at Harvard, and he said that maybe the incidence of women in science is something fundamental. And I tell you, it was a very provocative, controversial thing. He got fired because of it. It's way above my pay grade. I don't know how to answer your question.
It's way above my pay grade.
Oh, please, yeah, go ahead, yeah.
I'm a female, I might get away with this, but in the development of people, human beings, basically there's that issue of initiative versus doubt. And our society gives boys, in particular, about the second grade, a lot of opportunities to develop a sense of accomplishment through sports. So if you're raising children and you're thinking about that, sports are very important to a 6, 7, 8-year-old in terms of developing confidence and initiative. And that was Maslow's hierarchy, as you know, about initiative versus doubt, and it really is true. The more opportunities you give girls to develop a sense of competence when they're 6, 7, 8, and 9, it is critical to do that, because that is an eraser, because they start to have a sense of their own. Now, I don't know how many of you competed and were active in sports, but I'm going to bet a lot of you were in this room. I bet a lot of you were early participants in competitive sports. And I do think it has something to do with a resounding confidence level.
Let's take some last comment, and then I have literally 2 last slides. So let's take our three or four last comments, and I'll say some last things.
I was in competitive sports all through school. It does instill confidence, but I think for me, I think the point is it's fear, and I think that comes from a societal basis that we're supposed to be nice. I want to be accommodating. I'd like to get the job. If I ask, I won't get it. And I think that that starts at a certain age, and as much as you may in that home raise someone equally, there's outside pressures, and you're never in a bubble. And I think the fear is, if I ask, I'll be penalized.
And you may be.
Yeah, you may be.
I'm going to show you some data on that. Unfortunately, I think you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I watched this happen with my daughter, and to your point, Gail, and to yours, the sports analogy, she was amazing. She was so strong, she was so talented, and she was such a star. As soon as she hit junior high school, she carried that confidence forward. It transcended into being the girl asking the boy to the dance, and the girl being the one who was the outspoken and the aggressor, and it was the other girls that beat my daughter's confidence down. It was the most heartbreaking thing to watch, but that young lady who had all that confidence in the world in junior high school was wiped out by her.
And also, I am going to say this just briefly.
Yeah, please.
It has to do with the dynamic of attracting males when you get to be at that teenage year, because there's this assumption of what males like and how do you please the males. And that is a critical juncture for development for young girls. And I totally am on that one, because girls need not to think about what males want. And honestly, I mean, it's ridiculous. And in our culture, we just promote way too much. So it is cultural.
I guess another way of saying it with sports is that I think it's okay. You can't play a sport if you're not willing to lose, right? And I've had it described to me as, be like a duck. If you lose, let it roll off your feathers and go play another game. And that may be one of the most powerful things that competitive sports teach us.
I think that is true. I played basketball, and look how short I am. I didn't know. I just kept playing basketball. I was a great guard, but you know what? You must believe that you can push those girls, and you have to push them. But I will tell you, it's important that boys have mothers who are strong, working. So remember, you're making great contributions by the sons you're raising too, because my son constantly talks about loving to work for women because they're much more direct, they're much more honest, and they're much more engaging. So.
By the way, I say one thing and then take the last comment and then put up two last slides. There's a paper out now which I would urge all of you to consider by my colleague Kathleen McGinn, and I can send around these citations after the class. She has a very nice paper documenting, I think rigorously, scientifically, that working mothers have more successful daughters and sons. And this is controlling for all the usual things you want to control for. It's a nice and I think very compelling finding to support what Gail just said. Yeah?
I had male boss with sons and male boss with daughters. They deal totally differently. I feel I am more, they tend to listen more when they have daughters versus when they're male son, it's like, whatever.
Right.
So there's a difference. I don't know if we know this.
Let me put up just two last pieces of data, and unfortunately this data will confirm some of the things you just said, and then I'll stop and take any final comments. We'll finish right at 4:30 and have drinks and continue the conversation over drinks. This is the slide I mentioned earlier. I had this comment from one of my female students back in 2002. You know what, Professor? This is all data from some other world, less sophisticated world, but here at Harvard Business School, we don't succumb to these same biases. I did this study across all 900 first-year MBAs, and you can see on every possible dimension, men view themselves as being more effective than women as negotiators. Now, what I did was I asked them to self-assess within their cohort. So within the MBA class, 0 is worst, 100 is best, and 50 says you're about average. You're about right in the middle. Notice, both the men and the women think they're above average. So, that's maybe expected. But men thought they were better at creating value, for sure at claiming value, even building relationship. Men thought they were better than women at that. And then finally, overall negotiation ability, men said they were better than women. So I tell you, I did it once, only once. I will never do it again. It was so incendiary when I put this slide on the screen. I was untenured at the time. It came to the attention of the dean. It was not a pleasant experience. And not that I shy from confrontation, but it was just not a productive, I thought, helpful conversation to say, you know what, this is not just some outside world, this is us here at Harvard Business School. And I offer to you, because as successful women in the business world, it's something that's going on in our society that has to be fixed. It'll take some time. I do think it's getting better, but it's not some other world. It's the world that we all live in together. Last comment, I'm sorry I'm going to finish on a down note, but even more down note, but I'll finish with this. I wasn't planning on finishing this, but I have to finish with this. I was going to finish with a Fair Start case, but no luck with that. This is a bit hard to understand, but let me just explain it to you and I'll stop. This has to do with the social cost for women of negotiating. So this is experimental, but it's been replicated many different times. It's by my colleague Hannah Bowles, who's at the Kennedy School at Harvard. Some of you read her work. The experiment was female candidates and male candidates. Some were asked to not negotiate, that's the grayish bar, and some were asked to negotiate their starting salary. Okay. Now, both the men and the women paid a social cost. You can see social cost for men, social cost for women in the sense of the employer felt less willing to hire the person once they tried to negotiate their starting salary. But women paid a much larger social cost than did men. And that was true both with male employers and female employers. Bottom line is, women were punished for trying to negotiate more so than men.
And that's only from 2007? That's what it says on the paper. That study was only done a few years ago.
Yeah, although, as I said, this was kind of the first study along these lines. It's been replicated several times, including more recently. So it continues to be a very powerful finding. Hannah Bowles calls it the compensation negotiation dilemma. And it just highlights the complexity of the problem. You might say, well, gee, what's so hard about trying to negotiate everything? Well, it turns out that there is this penalty that women pay more so than men.
And is that true even when a woman is hiring the other woman?
Yes,
So
yes. This is true for both women employers and men employers. Yeah, that's right.
And is that just the initial job without having a relationship with the company? Is that
correct? And by the way, this was done in an experimental setting, so it's not the real world. But I do think it suggests something that tracks what some of you have been saying over the course of the day. All right. Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. So it's 2007. So this has been replicated several times since then, but this was the initial study. I don't have any great ideas here. I'll just be honest with you. I do think it's worth knowing about what the data says. I offer these as some potential recommendations, but I don't think there's any magic bullet here. It is a deep societal problem that we'll continue to all work on. But hopefully, over the course of the day, you have some tools in the toolkit that will allow you to at least improve the odds of being successful in this kind of arena. I'll stop and just say thank you to Gail, and thank you to all of you for a great, energetic day, and I'll see you at drinks in just a few minutes.
We owe you a great deal of thanks.
My wife is going to be shocked that I survived today.